The chair recognizes the honourable member for St. Barnabas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. Mr. Deputy.
Be curious.
Mr. Deputy.
You can just move on, no clarification.
As I was saying before, the member for Yamakra, stood up to object, rudely interrupted,
We get 10.
for him to object on what I was conveying on behalf of the president of the TUC. The Tribune article, Mr. Deputy, government not honoring industrial agreements, Mr. Deputy.
That's right.
A trade union leader, and I will table this. A trade union leader, and remember now, the member for Yamakra is a trade unionist. A trade former, well, they say once a trade unionist, always a trade unionist. A trade union leader is warning of rising workplace tensions. Now this June 10th. June 10th, 2024.
Oh my, that's recent.
June 10th,
That's recent.
2024.
That's very recent.
Right? Right? A trade union leader is warning of rising workplace tensions as he accused various government agencies of failing to either honor or execute industrial agreements. What does he say? The major problem we're having now is we made a commitment to the government that we will try to maintain industrial peace, and evidence shows we have done that for the last 3 years. What's happening now is that some of the agreements are signed but not being honored. That's worse. That's worse than getting it signed,
My Lord.
and you ain't even honoring them?
My Lord.
That's like walking up the aisle and saying I do, but not living up to your commitment.
Shame.
The chair recognizes the honourable member for Freetown.
The president, Obie Ferguson, is recorded as saying that the worst day for labor under the PLP is better than the best day for labor. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, St. Barnabas clearly isn't aware, as Yamakra would, when you have an agreement signed, you have something to take your employer to task over. When you don't have agreement signed, as they didn't have with the former administration, there's absolutely nothing to take your employer to task over. And so in cases before the court, when persons went for retroactive pay, the Court of Appeal ruled that because there was no agreement, it could not be upheld. And so it is misleading as a matter of law and fact that it is better to have no agreement than to have one that is agreed that might not be honored. That's what he said.
But I say again, Mr. Deputy, right? Again, the government that says one thing, but they do a next, Mr. Deputy.
Yes.
Government that says one thing and does something else. He said that they are not being honored. We've signed agreements, but the relevant government department is not honoring the terms of the agreement. We have the air traffic controllers, for example. BPL, for example, his words. We have the agreement in Grand Bahama with the Grand Lucayan Renewal Holdings. We have an agreement which is completed, but it's not executed. We have the nurses union, the doctors union. Practically all unions. That's the president of the TUC. TUC, Mr. Deputy. So all this talk about the industrial agreements that they've signed, the president of the TUC, I don't know the version that the member for Freetown is talking about, and we wish he would lay that. But the TUC president of June 10th, 2024, said that the government is not honoring industrial agreements, not honoring the industrial agreements. So he said y'all just talking, y'all just slapping up, but y'all are not honoring y'all agreements. Mr. Deputy.
The chair recognizes the honourable member for Yamakra.
What's the point of order?
The member quoted a document, and they say he took it out of context. and he did not read the context correctly. He is adopting it, and he must lay. And he must lay so I can verify, so the House can verify the quote that he claimed he is making. I'm just asking for him to lay. Thank you.
Mr. Deputy, I know when I lay these documents, he could go and take a look. I quoted the president of the TUC. And instead of the government saying, you know what, we probably need to speak to Mr. Ferguson and speak to the unions again to deal with these issues. Don't come in here, Mr. Deputy. Don't come in here, Mr. Deputy, and try to make a political issue. And it's the president of the TUC that has told this government that you all have been plenty talks on unions, but not holding up on the agreements. Mr. Deputy, what's the point of order, Mr. Deputy?
The chair recognizes the honorable member
What's the
for
point of order, Mr. Deputy?
Yamakura.
I thought
Mr.
you had...
Deputy, thank you.
A couple minutes ago, Mr. Deputy.
Mr. Deputy, the member seeks to mislead this parliament and the public once again. The member referenced 2 agreements in what he says he quoted out of the 40 agreements signed or the 30-something agreements signed. The member have not signed, they were in government. The same member standing on his feet in Barnabas. They did not sign one agreement. They're using a quote to mislead, and he brought up this topic of labor on a bill that has nothing to do or little to do with labor agreements. And I dare say the member is misleading the public, and he needs to lay what he has read because it's out of context in which he is presenting it, so that we can show that they are not only being hypocritical, they have no authority to speak on labor in this country after how they treated the unions. And that is stated on record. Thank you, Mr. Deputy.
Mr. Deputy, let me tell you what I find, and the Bahamian people and laborers find most amazing about this intervention from the member from Yamakura. Instead of him getting up and apologizing,
Cloud chasing.
instead of him getting up and apologizing to the many laborers that have been impacted by the fact that the president of the TUC has said, not my words, his words, the government not honoring industrial agreements. So if he is saying that the president of the TUC is a liar, then stand up on your feet and say that. I say, no, listen carefully. I say, if you're saying, listen. Okay, well, that's my point. So my point is, Mr. Deputy, government not honoring industrial agreements, Mr. Deputy. So if the member and the government has an issue with that, they need to stand up and say that the president of the TUC is wrong. That's what they need to do. Don't blame me. Speak to the president of the TUC, who said practically all the unions. That's the way I read it, Mr. Deputy. All right? But maybe you should call him. Maybe you should call him. Maybe you should call him, Mr. Deputy. Okay? Picture of him right here. Government not honoring industrial agreements. O.B. Ferguson, KC, just like Freetown, KC.
No.
KC.
No. Relax
The
yourself.
chair recognizes the honorable member for Freetown.
I don't like the up and down. The member misled to say we don't speak with Mr. Ferguson. If they had walked on with Mr. Ferguson at the end of, you say you need to talk to him. At the end of the Labor Day March, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when Mr. Ferguson, Golden Gates, and Cat Island addressed the crowd of persons on the pavilion at our Key. He would have heard what Mr. Ferguson said directly to us. He would have heard when Mr. Ferguson raised the issue of a certain club taking advantage of a Bahamian worker, which was immediately addressed. The bottom line to it, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because I worked with Mr. Ferguson on cases. He is a negotiator, and he will never be satisfied, as he shouldn't be, on behalf of labor. But to have the agreement signed so that you can enforce it and get money for your people is much better than to have nothing where you can't even take the government to the industrial tribunal or everything. And so that is what the difference between us and them is, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Right.
That's why he recorded.
You know, Freetown, I was quite impressed with that. You sound like the trade unionist.
Yeah.
But you sound like the trade unionist for Freetown, right? But again, government not honoring industrial
We
agreements,
fellas shouldn't
Mr.
threaten
Deputy,
people, man.
right?
We dealing with soldiers, man.
Right.
We don't fall for them.
But Mr. Deputy, Mr. Deputy,
You can't threaten them.
Mr. Deputy,
You can't threaten them. No, no. You
Mr.
can't-
Deputy,
You said you like them.
so
Yeah?
this instance where the government does one thing, this instance where the government does one thing and say the next, it is not simply, it's not simply an episode,
You know that song?
Mr. Deputy. It's not simply an episode. It's a condition.
I commend that song.
It's a condition
Drake Twin.
that this government has, Mr. Deputy. It's no different, Mr. Deputy, that we are still waiting from the member for South and Central Andros, still waiting on the explanation, as we've been saying, for the $2.5 million plane that has had several functions, Mr. Deputy. But can't get an answer on that, Mr. Deputy. So, Mr. Deputy, there was quite a discussion between the member for Marco City and the member for Exuma on the issue of tourism, specifically how do we make the tourism product better, Mr. Deputy? How do you make the tourism product better? And again, today, the member for Exuma would have reiterated, Mr. Deputy, this notion, in his view, that the member for Marco City is talking down tourism, Mr. Deputy. And Mr. Deputy, this question about making our tourism product even better than it is, Mr. Deputy, how do we increase the economic benefits to our people, Mr. Deputy? The very same thing, Mr. Deputy, and I said this before, the very same thing, and the member for Marco City has said this, the very same concerns or challenge that the member for Marco City has put out there relative to this disparity between cruise ship passengers and stopover visitors has been conveyed by many, many professionals and experts in the tourism sector, including Robert Sands, Mr. Deputy. And in this article, Mr. Deputy, in this article that I will lay, he says that this nation needs to place more focus on encouraging cruise passengers to return to this nation as higher spending stop-over visitors. That is Sandy Sands. And nobody would suggest that he is dumbing down or talking down the tourism industry. And this is what the member for Marco City and all of us on this side have been talking. How do we make our product even better? He goes on, Mr. Sands explained that the average stopover passenger spends about $2,700 during their visit to the Bahamas, while the average cruise passenger spends $85. So converting more cruise ship passengers to the land-based variety will ensure tourism delivers an even greater economic impact, Mr. Deputy. And Mr. Deputy, this runs parallel, if you will, Mr. Deputy, with, I saw today in the papers, and I'm sure a number of members would have seen it, that the cruise port intends to build a $35 million water park. $35 million water park. Hats off to them. They are doing what they must do to make their product more dynamic or even better for them. But the fundamental question we must continuously ask is how do we make the Bahamian experience, Mr. Deputy, as the port and Atlantis and Bahama and all of these places that are destinations within a destination, how do we ensure that more persons are coming to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and visiting our country primarily because of the Bahamian experience and not primarily because they want the Atlantis experience and then the Bahamian experience, and not to suggest that some of the hotels don't immerse our guests in a Bahamian experience, but the question is, how do we make ourselves and our product so competitive and so dynamic that persons now are enjoying a certain level of experience, and Sandy Sands talked about it in this article, outside of what the port and these various resorts are offering. Because for them, their fundamental goal is to keep their visitors in the port as long as they can, at Atlantis, on Paradise Island as long as they can, at Bahama. So our job as a country, Mr. Deputy, and again, not to suggest that this is not a partnership, but they have their product that they are trying to sell, and we can't blame them for that. So how do we make people, again, want to come on Bay Street? Are we doing what we need to do, Mr. Deputy, to get with antiquities and monuments and ensure that our forts and our historical places and historical buildings are providing the type of experience that persons who visit our shores, how do we ensure that they are getting the Bahamian experience that distinguishes us from visiting someplace else that got some sun, sand, and sea as well? What is different about the experience of when they come to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, Mr. Deputy? Mr. Deputy, I talked about, in my initial few minutes into this presentation, about the fiscal issues and how Bahamians embrace the conversations and the discourse and the dialogue about our fiscal issues. And every time the government or any government makes a decision regarding a fiscal issue, particularly one that impacts them in a negative way, Mr. Deputy, the Bahamian people, they stand up and they take note, Mr. Deputy. And so the legitimate questions about, and as the member for Marcus City said, that we do not oppose, pursuing additional option in regard to funding. He said that straight up, Mr. Deputy. So the question that we must continue to be able to address for the Bahamian people is why, when we make certain decisions, why have we made that decision? How will that accrue to the benefit of the Bahamian people? Right? So why the expansion of financing facilities and the need to do so? And to add to the already historical partnerships with the IDB and the Caribbean Development Bank. And we have not suggested, and all of our members have talked about this, we have not suggested that it cannot be a benefit to the Bahamian people. We've just asked, what does the government have in mind? What was the impetus? What was the thinking by becoming part of this membership, Mr. Deputy? Mr. Deputy, because on fiscal issues, Mr. Deputy, as we said, this government has been all over the place, Mr. Deputy. We've talked about them being a tax and spend government. We heard earlier that the member for East Grand Bahama talked about the $100 million loan to BPL that they've not come to Parliament to get authorization for. Talked about the issues regarding the $500 million that was not supposed to be used for debt refinancing, Mr. Deputy. Because we have a government, Mr. Deputy, that says one thing, Mr. Deputy, and does the next, Mr. Deputy. And as these happen, Mr. Deputy, as these things happen, and the Bahamian people consider what they are dealing with on a daily basis, Mr. Deputy. Mr. Deputy, I wish that the minister responsible for water and sewage was in here, Mr. Deputy. And my colleague, the member from Long Island, went into a great deal on a particular aspect of what the people of Long Island are dealing with and the issues surrounding that, Mr. Deputy. But, Mr. Deputy, got a message this morning, Mr. Deputy, about no electricity in Whale Point for 20 hours. No electricity in Whale Point for 20 hours. And so the people of Eleuthera, Mr. Deputy, are really having a difficult time, Mr. Deputy. Really having a difficult time. Another lady talked about, you know, her 80-year-old grandmother and the 4-month-old in the house, and how it's becoming difficult without water, Mr. Deputy. And you know, Mr. Deputy, I remember in December 2022, the member for Central and South Eleuthera, there was a letter talking about the conditions of these utilities inside Eleuthera, Mr. Deputy. And as this government continues to try to look back in the rearview mirror and blame everybody except take responsibility for themselves, the reality of it is we have the people of Eleuthera who are having to deal with the challenges of what some have said is like the dark ages, Mr. Deputy. Dark ages, Mr. Deputy. And they feel that it is not right, Mr. Deputy. And the government must find a way, Mr. Deputy. That's the government's job, not to point fingers, but to find a way to deal with those issues. I was hoping that the member for Elizabeth would be in here and maybe she could shed some light on why the electricity issues are happening to the degree that they're happening in Eleuthera, Mr. Deputy. Because, Mr. Deputy, these are the things that fundamentally matter. And no matter how we as politicians or how the government continues to pat itself on the back, these are the fundamental things, Mr. Deputy, that the Bahamian people are talking about. Fundamental things, Mr. Deputy. Getting messages now, Mr. Deputy, from the people in Bimini, from Bimini, who are talking about the increased fees that they are going to have to deal with now, more than the fees at Lyndon Pinland International Airport, Mr. Deputy. They feel there's a disparity. They feel that the way that the government is making decisions, it's lopsided, and where they would like to make some sacrifices and are prepared to make some sacrifices, where they're prepared to do that, the government isn't cutting them any slack in other aspects of their life, Mr. Deputy. Other aspects of their life. And so again, Mr. Deputy, the government continues to paint a picture of a world that they believe that the Bahamian people are in. But it's not the world that the Bahamian people are in, Mr. Deputy. And the Bahamian people are saying that the government has become tone deaf to the issues that they are facing, Mr. Deputy. The issues of the rising cost of living. The government has conceded that they have not been able to tackle inflation in the way that they had hoped, in the way that they had promised the people. While it is big of the government to acknowledge that they have failed in that regard, the reality of it is the negative impact on that on the Bahamian people continues to be something that they are faced with, Mr. Deputy, every single day, Mr. Deputy. I brought to the attention of Freetown a couple of months, Mr. Deputy, and I'll actually do it again because a number of those reserve police officers, Mr. Deputy, are still messaging. The last time I mentioned it in here, the member for Freetown did say it doesn't come under his remit. I was a bit concerned about that, as were the members of the reserve police officers who need to get paid. And many of them have still said that they have not been paid. Sorry? They've not been paid some of them for a year and a half. Monies that are owed for different things. Monies that are owed, gratuity, it's a lot of different situations. but
The
a
chair
number-
recognizes the honorable member for Freetown.
I don't know that any reserve policeman is entitled to gratuity by the nature of the payment. I am aware that there's an issue regarding pay for promotions. And the issue with that is that the promotions were not properly processed and not being properly processed by the police force. At the end of the day, that has to be corrected. The side opposite knows that in this public service that we have, you can do whatever you like, and if you don't do it correctly, there are consequences. And that is the most that has been communicated to me. Unfortunately, the ministry doesn't deal with that. The Police Service Commission doesn't deal with that. This minister, Mr. Deputy Speaker, has directed every reservist who has spoken with me on this fact. And the issue at hand is what is the current commissioner going to do with a process that, by all accounts, wasn't validly done by a predecessor.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy. Honorable member, I hear you, honorable member. But these reserve police officers, in some cases, they've said year and a half, 2 years, this is what they've explained, that they have not been paid. And I believe that it's incumbent, we believe that it is incumbent upon the government. I understand what you're saying in terms of what has happened, but that has to be unacceptable to the government that we have members of the Royal Bahamas Police Force who are saying that they have not been compensated, Mr. Deputy. It has to be. That is totally unacceptable, and it is totally unacceptable, Mr. Deputy, when from their mouths they quote the money that government is spending in other areas. And so we some would say, boy, y'all have a good time talking about this $2.5 million plane. For people, that means something. 2.5 means something. $220 million on consultants, it means something. And this is where governments lose the people, because you ask them for them to sacrifice so much, but yet they see that the government is not tightening its belt. Mr. Deputy, I'm talking about the point of Bahamians experiencing situations where money is owed to them. Money is owed to them.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Freetown.
I understand that there are some boxes that they check every debate. This is the second time this has been said. And I would say for the record, if there's some policeman who says, I've signed in for the maximum hours I can work as a recruit, as a reservist, and I haven't received any payment, that's one thing. And if there are persons like that, they do come to the ministry. And on some occasions, we find out when we query the HR department of the police that their sign-ins are not verified by a regular officer who must do so. If this is the issue about promotions, in order for finance officers to pay, they have to be satisfied that the promotion is valid or it didn't happen. As a matter of fact, the processing of the recent promotion is still working its way through for people to get their letters. And the officers who were promoted understand that they have to wait until all the formalities are done and they have their letters. If that is what it is, one can understand that. If it is something completely different, certainly anybody communicating, we do what we always do, make a query of the HR department of the Royal Bahamas Police Force.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would just add, the honorable member said that we come in here to check boxes. The Bahamian people aren't boxes to check. And if I have to come in here, and if we have to come in here every day and talk about the same concerns, if we're talking about the same concerns that Bahamians are facing, one, I can do it every day, and two, fundamentally that means the government isn't doing its job. If the Bahamian people are coming to us as an opposition to say that the government isn't doing what they need to do for them. So if the honorable member wants to view Bahamians as a box that we have to check, I would suggest to the member of Freetown, I'm sure he doesn't think that the people in Freetown are check boxes. These are people with concerns, the Bahamian people with concerns that needs to be addressed, Mr. Deputy. And no matter how the government tries to avoid it, point fingers other way. The government is in trouble with the Bahamian people, Mr. Deputy, and they're in trouble with, I didn't say F&Ms. F&Ms. They are in trouble with the Bahamian people because, as I've said before, PLP is paying these high taxes. PLP is paying these high taxes. PLP is they're dealing with the high electricity bills too. They see all the $220 million being used on consultants. And so while the government is talking about prosperity, 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 what they're saying is all they see is prosperity on paper, and it's not trickling down to the small man and to the poor people in this country who need the help, Mr. Deputy. Because I'm sure, for example, Mr. Deputy, if you ask my good friend from Pinewood, Mr. Deputy, if his ministry could use some of that money out of the $220 million to help those, the least, the lost, and the left behind, he would surely say so, Mr. Deputy. He would say so, Mr. Deputy. So, Mr. Deputy, no matter, again, Mr. Deputy, as I take my seat, no matter how this government tries to duck and dodge and lotion themselves up about what they feel they have been doing to the Bahamian people and doing for the Bahamian people, the reality is, Mr. Deputy, is that out there the Bahamian people are telling another story. It's not just the people in Eleuthera. It's not just the people in Andros and Abaco. It's all over the Commonwealth of the Bahamas where Bahamians, each of them, has a story about how their life is under this government and how their life has been for the last 2.5 years, Mr. Deputy. Their job is to fix the problems, not to point out what the problems used to be. They've been using this phrase a lot, legacy issues, Mr. Deputy. Legacy issues. They say they are legacy issues. It's just another way for them to say it ain't our problem. It's just another way to say that, you know what, we're not fixing it as fast as we could, so we're going to blame the other fellas who they kick out of office, Mr. Deputy. Who the Bahamian people kick out of office. Who the Bahamian people kick out of office. And the truth is, Mr. Deputy, probably as the members, the honorable members on the other side sit here today, if you tell them that the Bahamian people are saying that their time is up, they don't believe that, Mr. Deputy. They don't believe that, Mr. Deputy. They don't believe that the Bahamian people are saying that we are done. It takes an election, Mr. Deputy. It takes an election oftentimes for a government to realize their time is done. And then they ask the question, what just happened? That's what they say. What just happened? So, Mr. Deputy, so again, they're not honoring union agreements. They're taxing the Bahamian people like crazy. Every time you look around, there's an increased fee somewhere. You know, it's hello, goodbye, and a tax. That's what they're doing to the Bahamian people. Hello, goodbye, and a tax, Mr. Deputy. And you know, we had this discussion early in this debate about nuances and words and so forth, and words that you use. To the Bahamian people, no matter how the government say, we ain't increased no taxes. We've not created any new taxes. It's not so, Mr. Deputy. Mr. Deputy, it is an honor, Mr. Deputy, to stand here on behalf of the people of St. Barnabas to bring the concerns of the Bahamian people who have lost confidence in a government that continues to fail them, Mr. Deputy, and they are just waiting to have their say. Thank you, Mr. Deputy.
Thank you, honorable member.